Grace Lindsay is a computational neuroscientist based in UCL in London, and her research focuses on building mathematical models of how the brain controls sensory processing. She was awarded a Google PhD fellowship in computational neuroscience, and more recently she has written this particular book, Models of the Mind: How Physics, Engineering and Mathematics have shaped our understanding of the brain. So, Grace Lindsay, thank you very much indeed for appearing on this podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Let me start off by asking you a straightforward question, and that is, how did you actually come to write this book, and why did it need to be written?
So as you said, I am a computational neuroscientist. I've been working in this field for, by some definition, more than 10 years. So I've been using mathematics to understand the brain. And I felt that that approach to understanding the brain, while becoming increasingly more important and popular within the field of neuroscience itself, was never really explained to the broader public. There's a lot of books about how the brain works, but usually they don't tell you, the mathematical approaches that we're using to understand the brain. And I think it's becoming increasingly clear to people who study the brain that a mathematical understanding is going to be absolutely crucial. The brain is just too complex to just try to describe it with simple words and little, pictures and models like that. You have to write down equations at some point if you're going to try to understand the brain. And so I wanted to kind of let a broader audience into this way of studying the brain that's becoming so popular and becoming so important. I wanted to show people that even if you don't have a math background, you can understand why we use mathematical models and how we use them and what they've taught us about the brain. So that was kind of the motivation to write it. And also I just find the kind of interdisciplinary nature of a field like computational neuroscience very interesting, because there's people who come from totally different fields like computer science or physics, and they get an interest in the brain and they start applying their tools to the brain, and you get this really interesting synergy that changes how neuroscientists think about the brain. So those are the kind of stories that I wanted to share to really illustrate, how this method of studying the brain is really important and fruitful.
I noticed how rather cunningly you seem to avoid any equations. And I thought that as I was going through the book, there wouldn't be a single equation in the book. So to make it, I suppose, more accessible to a wider range of people. But then you do cleverly put in right at the very end a little section for those who are slightly more mathematically inclined, and summarise the things with equations, which I thought was a good compromise.
Yeah, I assume that there would be some people with a mathematical background who don't know much about the brain and, want to come in using the language that they learned in physics or engineering. So I wanted to actually show some equations eventually, but you're right. For the main text, it seemed maybe a little too daunting to have it full of equations.
There's that old story. I don't know how true it is, but the publisher tells the author that for every equation you put in the book, you halve the readership, which
Yeah.
which is always an off-putting thing, I would think, to any author indeed. But certainly you've got around that one, I think, rather well. So it satisfied me at the end when I saw some of those equations. Let me ask you though about the mathematics then, because mathematics is present within the book, and the question is it how is mathematics really connected to the mind and the brain? This is in chapter 1 where you start to deal with that. Is it possible to create, do you think, a mathematical model of the mind?
Yeah, I think to me and to a lot of practicing neuroscientists, the brain is the physical organ that's responsible for creating what people refer to as the mind, which sometimes just means kind of human behavior, really. If you're interested in the mind, you're probably interested in how usually humans think and act and all of that. And we believe and have a lot of evidence that the brain is controlling that. And so because it's a physical system, it's subject to the same laws as any other physical system. It is something that's tangible, and insofar as we can study it and come up with reproducible findings, we can turn those findings and facts about the biology into equations and build models that are meant to do somewhat similar things as what we know the brain does. So we can, start with models of individual neurons and connect those models of neurons the same way the brain has real neurons interconnected, and try to build something that can actually do the computations that we believe the brain is doing. So I think just as you can model the weather using mathematical equations, you can model other physical systems using mathematical equations, you can model the brain using mathematical equations.
I rather easily shifted from mind to brain and brain to mind, but what do you see as the connection between those two? Are they identically the same in the sense that the mind is entirely determined by the brain, and how do you distinguish them, or how do you talk about the difference between them?
Yeah, as I said, as a neuroscientist, I'm interested in how the brain performs computations that lead to intelligent behavior. And you could also say I'm interested in how the brain gives rise to the mind, because I would just kind of describe the mind more as the things that psychologists study, which is usually not actually thinking about the physical nature of the brain, but more looking at kind of the input output function of a human. If you show them this stimulus, how do they respond? What decisions do they make under different circumstances? That's kind of sometimes what people would call the mind. It's the thing that psychologists are studying, but the brain is what's producing that. And so there should be a way to connect those. There should be a way to study the brain and look at how the brain works and say, through this pathway of neural activity, this is how we create this behavior. Now, there's a little bit of a added complexity around consciousness and that kind of thing, which I would put a pin in. But for the most part, human behavior should be ultimately, at some point when we have enough information about how the brain works, we should be able to explain how, when you see some sort of input, it goes through your brain and it produces some sort of motor output. I mean, that's basically at the base level, that's kind of what we're interested in, because motor outputs can range from moving your body to moving your mouth and speaking. And so really just the fact that that's the physical system, you take in sensory information and you produce some sort of motor output, and that's all mediated through the nervous system in connection with other systems in the body. We should be able to explain that all by looking at the biology.
Okay, so creating models using mathematics, but you quote an interesting phrase which I picked up on, and it said that all models are wrong, simply because all models are just models. They simplify things, maybe too simplified. Do you think that because they don't capture the whole truth, then that models are the right way to go, mathematical models are the right way to go? Will they actually work at the end? Will they pursue something, get something from that?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think they're the only option, because we can, when it comes to mathematical models, because they're more concrete, people sometimes have more criticism of them. You can say, oh, this mathematical model doesn't have a term that represents this cell type in the brain, and that's the cell type I study, so this model can't be good enough. But even if you're not using mathematical models, you're using some sort of mental model in your mind of how you think the brain works. And you're maybe just using words to describe how you think it works, or you're using like a diagram that's just boxes and arrows and things. And those are missing things as well. Those aren't the full picture. They're not a complete replica of the brain. So just to have an idea in your mind of how something about the brain works means you have a model of how the brain works. And the difference between that and a mathematical model is that mathematical model is explicit and can usually contain even more complexity, because you don't have to hold it all in your mind. But I don't think that you can say that mathematical models are a problem because they're incomplete. It's a necessity that they be incomplete, because that means that you're getting at some understanding. That means you're saying this part is important to explain the phenomenon I'm interested in. This part isn't, and so I don't have to include it in my model. And that explicitness is really a benefit of them. You're saying very clearly, this is what I think matters to explain the thing I'm interested in explaining.
Okay, well let's go a bit deeper into that then, in terms of let's move slightly towards the physics level, because you discuss physics in another chapter. How is physics connected to the brain and the functioning of the brain? What does physics teach us about that?
Yeah, so insofar as the brain, has to obey all the same physical laws, that's a relevant connection between physics and the brain. And then there's a few different levels of influence that have come. So one of the big ones is from the understanding of electricity, and then learning that neurons use electricity to communicate along the cell. So once we were able to write down equations of electrical circuits, then that information was able to be used to build models of how neurons work, because you could use the same kind of electrical circuit terms like resistance and capacitance. It became clear that a neuron was kind of implementing an electrical circuit of sorts. And so you have that analogy, which is, it's an analogy because it's not exactly the same as an electrical circuit that a human built, but in some ways it's almost not an analogy, because there really are, charged particles building up on either side of the membrane of the cell. So it has this capacitance, and there's resistance about the ions flowing through the membrane. So it's really, in some ways, it's quite literally an electrical circuit. And so there's a very tight connection. And then in other areas of neuroscience, it really is more of an analogy. Like we can talk about the model that's used to explain magnets, and how that can be thought of as neurons interacting the same way particles in a magnet are interacting. And that's an analogy, because we're not talking about magnetism in a neuron. We're just saying that the math can kind of be used to explain certain properties of how groups of neurons behave. And that's a more abstract way in which kind of the ideas from physics have come into understanding the brain.
One of the things I really like about your book is the fact that it's not just a set of chapters on different mathematical techniques and tools, and physics is one of those, but it's also historical too. It tells you the story of how things start as well. So it's laid out in a historical way. And one of the things which I think goes back a long way is the idea of electrical signals traveling along nerve pathways within the brain and within the body. In fact, one of our local people here, she used to live a long time ago, picked up on this and wrote her book Frankenstein. Mary Shelley, who's sort of buried along the road in Bournemouth, not too far away, took up this idea of electricity being like the core of what constitutes life. And of course, there were other people who picked up on that too, and scientists who made something of that. But let's tie down a little bit more tightly that how this ties into the brain and the functioning of the brain. We've got the brain as a collection, or a massive number of neurons, all interconnected, and these neurons, they transmit electricity, don't they? I believe in some kind of spike. Could you tell us about the spike and how important that is in neurons?
Yeah, so the spike, it's also sometimes called an action potential. It's basically an electrical event that happens within a single neuron. And its primary purpose is thought of as kind of communication from one end of the neuron to another. So neurons, they have cell bodies, and they have axons that are the way that they send signals to other neurons. And then they have dendrites, which are how they collect the incoming inputs from other neurons. And basically, when a neuron has a spike, it's a way of sending a signal from the cell body down the axon, so that information can go on to other neurons. And axons can be short, but they can also be very long. So that's why you need to have like a very strong signal that can be sent. And yeah, it's in the form of kind of an electrical disturbance in the membrane. So the membrane of a cell can keep different types of ions separated. So you can get a difference in charge on the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell. And basically what the action potential is kind of a reversal of that charge difference that goes along the axon and kind of creates this wave along the axon, such that when it gets to the end of the axon, when the ion flows are flowing in, it changes the chemistry of the cell at the end of the axon and lets it emit neurotransmitters. And that's how the neurons talk to other cells. So those are chemicals they use to talk to other cells. So basically you have this electrical event, which is how the neuron sends a signal inside itself. And then that turns into a chemical signal so that the neuron can talk to other neurons.
So each of these neurons are connected to other neurons, and as they send out these pulses, they stimulate pulses in other neurons. It's kind of an all or nothing principle, isn't it? If they get enough I don't know, stimulus, then they'll fire off another, they'll be stimulated to fire off one of these pulses. Is that right? Have I got that correct?
Yeah, so you have this signal that becomes chemical in between neurons. Those chemicals latch on to the second neuron, which can cause a small electrical event in the second neuron. And if a neuron gets enough of those small electrical events within a short window of time, it creates its own spike and then sends its own signal off to the neurons that it's connected. So yeah, if you get enough of these inputs from other cells, then you create an output yourself. And once an output is created, it is all or none. It's basically you reach some threshold of input and you send this spike along your axon.
It always reminds me of a kind of a quantum principle. And having been a physicist myself in terms of quantum mechanics, the idea of an all or nothing approach. It's a bit like the photoelectric effect, where if you shine UV light on something, you get these electrons coming off, but they either come off or they don't, and it depends on the frequency, not about the intensity of the light. So some very similar things there, I think. I read something about something called the Blue Brain Project in 2015. That was in one of your chapters, I think. Can you tell us how that ties in?
Yeah, so the Blue Brain Project is, it's, kind of maybe one of the more well-known mathematical models of the brain, just because it was awarded a very large prize from the European government, a lot of money to fund this project. And it does more than just build this mathematical model, but this was a core component of it. And so basically, as I said, kind of because we have these, equations that describe electrical circuits, and the neuron is acting like an electrical circuit, we can just use those equations and kind of say, this is what a neuron is. We can use the equations of electrical circuits to model what a neuron does. And once you have that, then you can kind of start adding a lot of bells and whistles to it to get an even more accurate model of what a neuron is doing. And that can include how the shape of the neuron impacts its electrical properties and all these things. And you can create quite elaborate models of neurons, and you can use data from real neurons to create those models. And so that's part of what the Blue Brain Project was doing. It was getting data to understand the electrical properties of real neurons and building mathematical models to replicate that as closely as possible, and then also connecting a lot of those neurons in the same way that they would be connected in the brain, at least the same kind of broad patterns of connectivity amongst neurons, and just building this very large computational model run on supercomputers, millions of parameters and all these things, to really just try to create almost the most detailed model of a very small chunk of brain that anyone has tried to create, and to gather enough data to make that possible as well, which is sometimes the data is the limiting factor in building these mathematical models of the brain. We don't know what parameters to use or what kind of equations to use if we don't have enough data. So they were collecting a lot of very detailed data and then really just kind of trying to replicate that in a mathematical model.
It also gives you an idea of how large and complex the whole human brain is, because I think that model, which is a vast one that was used, is only for a very tiny part of the brain. Do you think we're anywhere near being able to model a full human brain? How far away would that be, do you think?
At that level of complexity, it would still be very, very far away. But this goes back to the original point about models, where you try to identify what really matters, and you can model neurons as even simpler than an electrical circuit. You can use a very, very simple equation to model neurons, and try to build a large network of very simple neurons, and that's far less computationally expensive. And that's essentially what artificial neural networks do. And those are pretty popular in artificial intelligence today. And so if you're just trying to get some sort of interesting behavior out of the model, have it do some sort of interesting computation, you might not need the full biological details. If you're really interested in the biological details, then you're going to build a model that includes a lot of them, but you might be asking different questions, with that model. So it depends. If we're talking about actually just kind of fully replicating the biological complexity of the human brain at scale, then yeah, that's kind of almost inconceivably far off at this point, because even this Blue Brain project, which was very detailed, there were still plenty of things it didn't include, and that would scale up the size of that model as well.
Oh, okay. But okay, let me ask you this question, which I think puzzles me and may puzzle probably everybody. But you've got this model of neurons, firing, connecting to other neurons. They're setting off other neurons firing in a whole cascade kind of system. How does that tie in with the thought processes? Or let's call it logical processes. Can those firing of neurons connect to the process of logic, which is what reason is really based upon? What is the connection between logic and firing neurons? Is there any?
Yeah, so yeah, this relates to this approach of artificial neural networks, and kind of the origination of artificial neural networks was actually a direct connection to logic, because as we were talking about, the neural response is all or none. You know, it's either spiking or it's not spiking, and there's no in between. And so in the 1940s, there was a pair of scientists, McCulloch and Pitts, who saw in that binary response a relationship to formal logic, in that, you know, statements are true or false. And so they kind of interpreted the firing of a neuron as representing a binary truth value of a statement. And they showed that you could create little neural circuits that implemented basically logical expressions. So you could create the way that you connect the neurons, could make a circuit implement and or these Boolean logical functions. So they found a very explicit relationship between logic and neurons. That's not how it's thought of today anymore, because the circuits aren't that clean and we don't think that they're working that way. But we still have this ability to build artificial neural networks that can do very difficult, I mean, certainly in the history of artificial intelligence, these are tasks that are very difficult and require, you know, you can say require some kind of logic to solve. I mean, we have artificial neural networks that can play video games and chess and Go, and these games that were kind of, you know, the highest test of artificial intelligence when artificial intelligence was getting started in around the 50s and 60s. We now have systems that can do that very well. And you know, you can't necessarily point to different parts of these artificial systems and say that's where the logic is and that's where it's thinking about, you know, whatever. Although depending on the architecture and some of them, you can say a little bit more about how the system is working internally. But we know that we can produce systems based on a bunch of neurons interacting that can produce what has been labeled intelligent behavior. What, you know, being the best player at Go, we've certainly considered intelligent in the past, and we now have systems, artificial systems, that can do that. And so we kind of have to accept that even if it's not, you know, written down as formal logic, they're doing something that's intelligent.
So, if I understand what you're saying, that the brain does not operate according to the formal rules of logic, but rather you have something else, this neural network, which is not so much operating in a formal logical way, but comes to its decisions in a different kind of way. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the case that we don't analyze neural circuits in that way of trying to think about what logical function are they implementing. And part of the reason for that is, while the neuron does have this binary response, that's actually not kind of what's considered the most important output of it. Instead of thinking, did the cell have an action potential or not, we think more about the rate of action potentials in a short amount of time.
Yeah.
So then that becomes a graded signal that's no longer binary. And you get these kind of representations of information that are distributed across a whole population of cells, and they are more kind of graded or continuous. And so you don't, it just doesn't map neatly onto the concepts of formal logic anymore.
Okay, so what exactly, how would you define or describe for us a neural network, and how does it, and is it related presumably to the neural networks of computers, and how does that connect with the other neural networks in the brain itself, or is it just a model of what we think might be there?
Yeah.
What is that? The
Yeah.
neural
So
network?
artificial neural networks do kind of, they exist almost in between computational neuroscience and artificial intelligence. They are definitely inspired by how real neurons work. The basic unit in an artificial neural network is an artificial neuron. And what an artificial neuron does is it takes in inputs from other artificial neurons and it produces an output. So, you know, that's the basic thing that a real neuron does. And it can do that with a very simple function. Usually it just kind of takes a weighted sum of its inputs. And if that sum is above zero, then it just outputs that sum. If that sum is below 0, it just sets the output to 0. So it's the same idea that there's this threshold, and above the threshold, you actually produce output. Below the threshold, you don't produce output. But you can connect these neurons up, you can stack them in layers, and then you can train them through certain algorithms to perform different tasks. And basically what that training does is it changes the connection strength between neurons. So it can make one neuron more strongly drive another neuron. It can make it weakly drive it or shut it down. It's those weights between the neurons that determine what the network does, the computations it performs and the tasks that it performs. So that's what you're changing when you train the network. And so this still, it's very simple, it's pared down, but it has very clear relationships to the real brain because neurons are input-output units in the brain, and the connection between neurons changes with learning. That is a way in which learning happens biologically, is that the connection between one neuron and another can be stronger. And usually what that means is maybe you're releasing more of this chemical neurotransmitter, or the cell that's receiving it has more receptors for it, so it receives it more strongly. Some physical changes, at that gap between the neurons that make the strength between that connection stronger or weaker. But that is the basis of learning in the brain, and that's the basis of learning in these artificial neural networks.
So, for example, if I'm learning to play a guitar or play the piano, for example, and if I have to stretch to a strange and unusual chord sequence, which my fingers are not accustomed to do, but I practice and I practice and I practice and I practice until it becomes natural to me. What's actually happening there, if I've understood what you said correctly, is that pathways are being forged in the brain by that activity. Is that right? So the connections are made stronger between neurons? Is that what's going on?
Yeah, they can be made stronger or weaker, but yeah, we would assume that there are changes in connection strength in the brain, and also potentially, for a motor task, it could involve more downstream areas, some changes in maybe spinal cord, even potentially, depending on how much training you're having. But yeah, certainly we would expect to see changes in the strength of connections between neurons as a result of that kind of learning.
Okay, then. So the question then becomes: is that what constitutes memory? And is that all that constitutes memory? How are memories created? Are they created by that process, or is there something more to them?
So we definitely believe that the changes between neurons are a very big part of how memories are created and stored. And there's this notion of what's called Hebbian learning, which is neurons that fire together, wire together. So the more that two neurons have activity at the same time, if neuron A fires and then neuron B fires, that connection between neuron A and B is going to get stronger. And then, so that means that kind of the more you have an experience or encounter something that pairs these two neurons, now you're going to be able to make that association yourself. So you're creating an association from having observed an association, basically. So that's definitely a big part of it. I don't want to oversimplify. I mean, there can be things that happen within the neurons themselves, not just between neurons, that can change with learning, and people are exploring that as a form of memory. But certainly the dominant thought about how memory and learning happens in the brain focuses on the connection between neurons.
Okay. One thing I've noticed personally is that well, as you get older, it becomes more increasingly difficult to memorize various things or to remember various things. But I do notice that when an event is accompanied by a strong emotion, the emotion somehow seems to embed that memory much more firmly. You remember those events quite strongly. The classic case, I suppose, is everyone used to remember, certainly of my age, where they were and what they were doing when they heard that, for example, 9/11 took place, or when JFK was assassinated. You kind of you get this emotional response, which then seems to affect the memory. Is there any model or understanding of that?
Yeah, so that can partly be due to the presence of neuromodulators, which are a different type of chemical that neurons can send to each other. And it's more of a global signal kind of, whereas between a neuron, you have very local communication from neuron A to neuron B. Neuromodulators can be kind of more dispersed, kind of they diffuse through the brain, and they can be the result of, an emotional state, or for example, in the book, I talk about dopamine and how you need to have dopamine present for some types of learning to happen. So normally you have this heavy in learning where just if neuron A fires and then neuron B fires, that'll change the connection strength. But sometimes you need to have a neuromodulator present for that to happen. The neuromodulators can kind of change the state of the circuit and they can kind of turn learning on and off.
I see. So the dopamine is the neural modulator, and it enhances the flow between the synapse or across the gaps, or what does it do? How does it improve or unimprove the
I'm trying to remember. I don't know if I know the exact mechanism for dopamine, but usually it would attach to perhaps the neuron B in this scenario and just allow that neuron to have changes in its own membrane, such that when neuron A fires again, it'll be more sensitive to that firing. But I don't know the exact mechanism.
Okay. Let me move on to another chapter in your book, which is about randomness in the brain. Because we've got all these firing neurons, we've got a whole pile of things. Sometimes they're predictable, sometimes they're not predictable, it seems to me. Maybe they're globally predictable in some respect, but there's a lot of random firing going on, and the neurons fire unpredictably. What's the randomness used for? Have you got any idea of how that ties in, and how that where it comes from, and how it makes the brain function?
Yeah, this has been a real mystery that people struggled with for a while, because it is the case that if you put an electrode in the brain and listen to a neuron, and you show, usually these are animal studies, so you show an animal, maybe the same image over and over, you would think, the animal's just sitting in the same chair, looking at the same thing over and over. You would think that neuron, if it's representing visual information, that it would just have the same response each time. It seems the same thing, it should respond the same way. But what we find is that, on average, you get some firing rate, some response from this neuron that is constant, but each individual presentation has a little bit of jitter around that average. So you're kind of, sampling from some distribution, and you're not getting the exact same response. And people were surprised by this. And there was a thought, neurons are part of biology. Biology isn't perfect. Maybe it's just too hard to have a completely perfect response to the same input, because things can happen in the neuron that introduce randomness. But then when you take a neuron out of the brain and put it in a petri dish and apply a stimulus to it, an electrical stimulus to get it to respond, it can have really reliable, like identical responses to the same input. So in that case, when it's isolated on its own, it can work as an almost perfect machine, yet in the brain, it seems to be very noisy. And so what people have come to conclude is that this is actually a function of neurons interacting in the brain, and two different types of neurons: excitatory neurons, which cause other neurons to fire, and inhibitory neurons, which prevent other neurons from firing. When they kind of go at it, an individual neuron is getting input from both types, and as they go at it, they create this, they're normally in balance, but they can have slight slips where you get kind of this noisy output as a result. And people have thought, what is this for? Why would you want to have a noisy brain? And some people have thought of, reasons why the noise itself is helpful, which is it can help with learning and exploration, because you don't necessarily want to have the exact same response to the same stimulus all the time. You might want to kind of try out different outputs to different inputs and see if one pathway leads you to something better. So there could be a reason for exploration, but also people kind of think of it as maybe just a necessary, side effect of having this tight balance between excitation and inhibition. And that tight balance is helpful because it allows the neurons to respond faster. So if you have a neuron that's getting a bunch of excitatory input and a bunch of inhibitory input, and so normally it's not firing at all, because they cancel each other out, when it gets a little extra bump of excitatory, it can respond really quickly, because now it's just going to be pushed entirely over its threshold and it'll start responding. And you can only get that kind of very, very fast response if there's already a lot of excitation into the cell, and you just need to kind of move the balance a little bit. So that's one of the benefits of having excitation and inhibition in balance like that. But another outcome is that it makes noisy responses.
Right. That's interesting. One thing which people who just have a very cursory view of the brain may have come across, of course, is the idea of brain waves. It's very much a science fiction kind of thing of the past in the 50s and so. But you know, we've come across EEGs, electroencephalogram graphs, where you have these broad waves. I don't know what generates them. How does this connect to the firing of neurons and the other brain activity that's going on inside? How is this global wave pattern, and where does that come from?
Yeah, so that's also related to this excitation and inhibition balance that happens in the brain. And basically, if you have a network that's kind of in balance and is producing these noisy outputs, you can kind of play with the balance of the excitation and inhibition and get that same population of neurons into a regime where it's having these big oscillations. So instead of having the excitation and inhibition fight each moment, so you get noisy outputs, you just get periods of time where there's strong excitation, and then the inhibition comes in and knocks that excitation down, but then the excitation comes back, and you just get these big waves of activity where neurons are firing, and then they stop firing, and they're firing, and then they stop firing. And if you have a bunch of neurons that are doing that same, firing, not firing all together at the same time, the same frequency in the same phase, then you create a signal that's large enough to be read out through the skull. And that's kind of what these strong EEG signals that you see during sleep or during seizures, that's what's happening, is that you have a bunch of neurons that are doing the same thing all at once, creating these big waves of activity. And it's just this electrical activity that neurons use. You can kind of read that through the skull if they're all talking, at the same time. When they're in this more kind of chaotic, noisy regime, you get much weaker signals on the EEG.
And do they mean anything?
Uh,
These large
that's
scale waveforms. What do they? What's the implication of them?
Yeah, so we certainly, the ones that come along with sleep or with seizures, those have a clear relationship to stages of sleep, or to, when a seizure is happening. A seizure, is important. When neurons are all firing together, they can't actually do a lot of information processing because they're just doing this, march that they do together. And so that's what's happening during a seizure, and that's a problematic state, of course. The waves during sleep are real effects of the brain going through different stages in sleep. When it comes to the signal you can pull out from the EEG during wakefulness and task engagement, there are sometimes certain very strong signals that are easy to pull out. Sometimes surprise. If someone is doing a task and something surprising happens, something unexpected happens, you can sometimes get a strong signal from that. But there is debate about how much we can really learn from things like EEG in a normal wakeful state. When people are just doing something regular, there are people who think there is enough information in there, but that we're actually learning about, how the brain is working, if it's in different attentive states. Other people think that it's a little bit kind of like, I don't know, reading tea leaves, or just trying to pull out this information when there isn't really that much there.
Yeah.
So there is a debate about how useful some of the smaller signals are in an EEG.
Too low resolution, possibly. I don't know.
Yeah.
Let me move on to another chapter in your book, which is about processing visual images. The brain does an amazing job in processing what's in front of it, and the eyes and the retina, and what comes from that. It's recognizing patterns. It's doing all kinds of things. How does the brain make sense of patterns, and how does it understand what's in front of it in terms visually?
Yeah, so this took quite a bit of experimental work to find out. People had a lot of ideas about what might be happening. They thought that there were just basically like a store of templates in the brain, and every visual scene that came in, you were just comparing to some template. But that wouldn't actually work, because the same visual scene can actually look very different depending on lighting or angle, or very small changes that to us don't matter at all for understanding what's happening in the scene, but matter a lot for the actual wavelengths of light and their location that are hitting the eye. So now we have an idea of how this process works that's more about kind of a hierarchical, many different stages, each doing their own small job to create a more kind of invariant understanding of what's happening in the scene. And the first main stage happens in the primary visual cortex, which is in the back of the brain. And basically what the cells in that area seem to be responding the most to are small oriented edges. Basically, if there's a place where there's, what would look like a line, or a place where one color ends and another color starts, that kind of line signal is very salient to those neurons. And they each have their own place in the visual field that they pay attention to. And if a line in the right direction shows up in the right place, that neuron will fire a lot. Those are kind of the basic features. And from there, you can actually just build up to a lot of different shapes. So neurons that receive input from these line detecting neurons, if they receive the right kind of input, they can detect a corner. You just get one neuron that represents this line and one neuron that represents that line. Those send input to the next one, and you can create a corner, and you can build up to complex shapes. And through this kind of hierarchical process, you can create neurons eventually later on in the brain that can respond to faces or recognize objects, and do all of the things that we need to actually understand a visual scene.
Okay, I've got to ask you this. So how does one neuron get to represent a horizontal and another neuron get to represent a vertical? How does that happen?
Yeah, so that's a function of their own inputs. So the same way that the corner neuron has to get the right kind of inputs from the line neurons get input from a part of the brain that is in the subcortex, and they represent not lines, but basically just small dots of information, of small dots where the contrast is different. So a dark dot on a light background, or vice versa. And if you get a series of dots in a row, if the line neuron gets input from those dot neurons, and they're all in a row, then it will fire when there's a line, basically. So it's all just this building up from lower stages to create more complex shapes.
But aren't you saying that some neurons are almost dedicated to, say, horizontal lines, and some neurons are dedicated to but how do they get to dedicate themselves? How does this particular neuron say to the other one, I'm going to do vertical ones, you take the horizontal ones? I mean, that's a silly way of putting it, but how do they decide that neuron is the one that's going to be horizontal?
So it is the case that in each location in visual space, you have neurons that prefer each of the different orientations. They kind of form a little pinwheel where they all have their own preferred line orientation. And that is it seems to be pretty, it's not like hardwired, but it's a very strong developmental process. And you need to be exposed to visual stimuli during a critical period in development, in youth, for that to develop correctly. If an animal is exposed to only vertical lines, they won't develop neurons that respond to horizontal lines. So it's a combination of kind of genetic programming to set the system up to have this kind of response patterns, but you also need some experience to come in and actually get things to settle the right way.
So we're not actually born with neurons which do vertical and horizontal, they're actually constructed.
I don't remember the exact timeline, because you actually do get some visual information pre-birth. But yes, somewhere around that time, there's a critical period.
This may tie in with Chomsky's idea that language and the recognition of language and the use of language is innate in the brain in some respect, in somewhere or other. And I suppose there's a similar innateness about pattern recognition then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me, you mentioned within this context something called convolutional neural networks. Does that tie into this, and what are they?
So these are, again, a type of artificial neural network, but they're a type of artificial neural network that is based even more so on the visual system of animals. And so it's using the same principles. There are artificial neurons, they connect to each other and all of that, but it's trying to replicate this hierarchical process of having some neurons that look for certain shapes, and they span the whole visual field, and they look for that shape anywhere. And different neurons will look for a different type of shape. And then you have a second layer which gets inputs from those neurons so that you can create these kind of corner detecting things because they're getting input from the first layer. And so you can put in an image into these artificial neural networks, like an actual pixel image that you took with your phone. And if they're trained correctly, they can tell you what's in that image. And it's really based, it's an abstract model. It's not a perfect replica of biological vision, but it is based on the basic principles of the visual system that were learned in the 60s, basically.
Okay. And what about, I mean, alongside the brain looking and interpreting patterns and visual stimulus, about the motor function of the brain? How does the brain actually determine that, say, I'm going to raise my arm or not, make some movement? How is that wired in the brain?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we know the kind of the basic anatomy of the motor system. There are areas in the frontal cortex. There's a premotor area and a motor cortex, and the motor cortex basically has like a map of the brain where different parts of it correspond to different parts of the body, and it crosses it goes from one hemisphere of the brain controls the other side of the body. So your right motor cortex has a map for your left fingers and your left arm and your left I guess your left leg and other things that are lateralized. So you have this map of your brain running along your motor cortex. And so those cells are firing when that part of the body is being moved, and they connect to that part of the body, sometimes rather directly, maybe just making kind of one stop in the spinal cord to switch over to a neuron that controls the muscle. Sometimes it makes a few stops in different parts of the brain. But basically you have neurons in your motor cortex that are responsible for controlling different parts of the brain. And you have other kind of subcortical areas that are maybe more responsible for more automatic responses. But when you're really thinking about how you're moving your hands, then the part of your motor cortex that controls your hands is engaged.
So are you saying that a particular neuron would control a particular muscle in the same way that a particular neuron might indicate a horizontal line, or is that different?
So the mapping wouldn't be quite so neat. There would be kind of a whole population of neurons in the motor cortex that are responsible for sending the signals that ultimately, through their interaction, lead to the control of a certain muscle.
And you mentioned something about how they, not necessarily the muscle, but the movement or the direction of the muscle which it moves, or if you move a hand horizontally or vertically, that's a different, a more subtle, mapping, I should think, isn't it?
Yeah. So this basically, we had the visual system and people were studying that, and they found these nice mappings between, this neuron responds when there's a line in this location. And then people have kind of tried to do the same thing for the motor cortex, like this neuron should fire when this muscle moves this way, but they haven't been able to find that neat mapping. And so we can study the motor cortex and we can understand it sometimes in terms of, when your hand is moving in this direction, these neurons will have a certain signal, or sometimes when it's producing this much force, it'll have a certain signal. And there's been different ways that people have conceptualized it under different conditions, but they've never found something that's super neat about how the motor cortex relates to movements.
Unsurprising with such a complex thing. You've also got a chapter on information theory. I'm sorry to jump around, but how is information carried in the brain?
Well, that's to some people still a very open question. But as we've been talking about, neurons send these signals to each other, and you can look at the rate of a neuron's response, how many spikes it sends in a certain amount of time. And that when I say a neuron responds to an oriented line, what I'm saying is the firing rate of that neuron, the number of spikes that it produces, goes way up above its baseline when it sees that line. And so that's how we're saying that neuron encodes that or prefers that. We're just basically describing a relationship between the input stimulus and the firing rate output of a neuron. And so the rate of the neuron has been one of the more popular ways of thinking about how a neuron encodes information. There are other possible ways that could be happening, and different brain areas could be using different schemes. So the timing of a spike could matter, and this matters more in the auditory system, where very small differences in timing between the left and right ear are actually very important for us localizing sound. And so it's believed that exact timing of when a spike arrives at a neuron, you get one spike from the left ear and one spike from the right right ear, and that difference in timing is what you want you want that information to be read out from that neuron. So you could use timing. You can use timing between spikes. You can use what we've talked about with oscillations. Is a neuron firing when all the other neurons are firing, or is it firing out of phase? That could be a way of encoding information. It is something that's a little bit open, even though most people do focus mostly on just the rate of firing of a neuron.
Okay, so it's a very, very complex. The more I talk to you about it, the more complex I'm beginning to see how the structure is. And of course, it's probably complexity upon complexity upon complexity. Let me ask you a more basic question then, considering the complexity that we've looked at. What I'm conscious of, being a brain owner, is that I make decisions all of the time to do this or not do that. How does the brain make those decisions? Well,
I don't know if that is a simpler question.
Simpler
There are
in the
many.
sense of I have a simplistic approach to this subject.
There are many computational and mathematical models that people have of how this process works. One model focuses on kind of the use of probability in decision making, and how you would want to kind of integrate information and use information that's integrated over time to come to a decision, and also using prior information. So this is where kind of Bayesian ideas of cognition come in, where you have information you're receiving right in the moment, but you don't want to just use information you're receiving right in the moment to make a decision, because you kind of need context basically to understand that. And so you combine it with prior information that you have, and through that combination, you come to a conclusion. And so this is just kind of Bayes' rule, basically, which says that you have a probability of the data you're getting now, and you have a probability of an outcome that's based on your prior knowledge, and you combine those things to get a probability distribution of what you really think is happening in that moment. And that's a pretty popular model that's applied kind of in all different types of tasks in cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience, including just something as basic as perception, which we don't really think of as a decision that we're making. But anytime you interpret the world around you, as we talked about before, like it can be ambiguous. There you can get incoming information that doesn't actually decide whether the world is one way or another for you, but you have to bring to bear your prior knowledge about the world to make that interpretation. And that can use Bayesian-like computations as well.
So that leads, we're coming rapidly to the end of this. Leads us to deeper waters in many ways, the way in which is there any room in this model? We've been talking about the brain as a mathematical element, as a purely physical object which has neurons firing. But is there any room in this kind of model for the idea of what old-fashionedly would have been called free will? Or is there any room for any idea of where the sense of I comes from, the me that's in there? Is it me that's making these decisions, or is it something else which is making these decisions and I just am aware of it?
Yeah, so I think the sense of I, there are mathematical and computational models that try to explain that as well. And it's usually kind of this idea that there is, on top of, all these brain processes that are happening, there is a charge of kind of monitoring and keeping track of all of these brain processes. And so that's how you can kind of feel like you're experiencing your mind, or you're experiencing a decision being made, is that there is kind of a computational unit that is supposed to be integrating all these different computational units that are doing lower level things, or even predicting what they will do, as a way of kind of creating an agent that can act in a unified way if you have something that's kind of connecting all these processes. So it's that sense of agency, or the sense of self, is not outside the realm of mathematical or computational models. People have attempted to do that for sure. The free will thing is a little more difficult to talk about, just because different people have different kind of notions of what that means. I know some people, relating to the randomness that we were talking about, the noisiness of neurons, some people like to point to that as a source of free will, but I don't think that aligns with most people's belief about what free will is, if that's I'm making a decision, then saying that the randomness of my neurons made a decision is not, that's not your will, that's randomness.
Yeah.
So I don't find that a satisfying thing. I think that we have our experiences of making decisions, and we make decisions, and that process happens, and that's all correct and true. That is what's happening. At the very root of it, we live in a physical world, and our brain is subject to the same physical laws as everything else. And so in some sense, it's, deterministic, excluding quantum mechanics. But again, that's randomness, so that doesn't save you either. But yeah, so
what do you
practically
think,
speaking, sorry.
Do you think that you have free will or not?
At the level of definition that I define free will, yes. Like, I experience decision making. If I chose to not make a decision, the decision wouldn't be made. It's just, the free will is happening at a level above the physical response of neurons. It's happening at this kind of more abstract conscious level of me experiencing a decision. And yes, we know that people can be influenced by all kinds of things that they're not aware of, and all of that. And that's important to understand about our brains and ourselves, that our decisions we don't always make them for the reasons that we think that we're making them. But to act in the world, you still have to make them. So for me to say I don't have free will wouldn't change anything about how I act, because I still have to make decisions.
Kind of pragmatic approach to things,
Yes.
I suppose. But let me ask you this final question, I suppose, and that is the computer really a very good model for the brain? Is the brain really no more than a computer then? Is it operating in the same kind of way? It's just that we haven't got enough understanding of the complexity, or is there something more to the brain which could not be modeled as a computerized or mathematical system?
Yeah, I don't have any reason to believe that there's more. I think, at least in terms of kind of, something like the Turing test idea of deciding if we've come to a good model of the brain. I think once we understand the brain well enough, we'll be able to build a model in a computer that when it interacts with you, you won't be able to tell that it's not a human born, through carbon and everything. So we should be able to replicate the input-output functions of a human, and even kind of the brain activity that a human would make. We should be able to do that well enough once we've gotten far enough along. Now, that may be a very, very long time off, because there's a lot we don't understand about the brain, but I don't have any reason to suspect that we're going to hit some fundamental limit. That doesn't seem to be a necessary part of the explanation to me.
If we can replicate it, does that mean it's the same?
Well, by some definition, yeah. I mean, are two humans the same? I mean, it's to get something that's within distribution of humans. I mean, they're never going to be identical. But if you get to the level where you can create something that is in many ways indistinguishable from a human, then I think you've done something quite impressive.
Okay. I said that was the last question, but I have a supplementary, and that is, what are you working on now then? What's your focus of your research at this particular moment?
Yeah, so my research is related to what we talked about on visual processing, and using these networks that can take in images and do visual processing.
Convolutional neural network.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the convolutional neural networks. I use those to try to understand biological visual processing. And in particular, I'm interested in how we process images over time. So it's known that if you have an image flash in front of you very quickly, usually you can actually describe it fairly well. You can say what was in it, even if it was flashed for a tiny fraction of a second. But as soon as we start kind of distorting that image, making it weaker, making it harder to see, you need more time with it to be able to say what's in it. And I'm trying to build models that can replicate that process and understand what is happening over time that makes us be able to make sense of an image when it's kind of degraded.
Grace Lindsay, thank you very much indeed for your time. And if you're interested in looking at the subject any further, don't forget Models of the Mind by Grace Lindsay. It's published by Bloomsbury, and it's priced in England, at any rate, £16.99. You might be able to get it cheaper than that on Amazon or somewhere else, or good bookshops. And as the top line says by Sean Carroll, this will change the way that you think about thinking. Thank you very much, Grace.
Thank you.